Welcome to Fast Keto. I'm your host, Ketogenic Girl. Hey guys, welcome to this episode of Fast Keto. I'm thrilled to have Amber O'Hearn joining us again today. She is a data scientist by profession. She joined us on the last episode to talk all about her zero-carb carnivorous lifestyle, which she has been following since 2009. And I just love having Amber on the show. She's such a delight to speak to, but she also has so much evidence and research backing up the lifestyle that she follows. And today we talk about some of her recent presentations at Low Carb Vail, how she talked about ketosis and eating protein levels, the brain, how it thrives in ketosis, and even weaning babies onto meat, which has now been adapted by the Canadian government as, I believe, a recommendation. We talk a lot about all of that today on today's episode, so I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed recording it with Amber. All right, guys, I am so excited to tell you about the brand new version of my free ebook, Keto Reset. I first released it in 2015. I spent the entire summer working on this to make a brand new updated version, and you can get your free copy by going to ketogenicgirl.com, click on free ebook, and you can sign up for my newsletter and you will receive your free copy of the book. It covers so many different topics, including finding your optimal protein range, how to use the different macronutrients to your benefit, a starter grocery list. It's such a great place to start, and a guide to quitting sugar. I added so many new sections and expanded it, and I'm really happy with the final result. I think you guys will get a ton out of it. And if you are not a beginner to keto, there's still a ton of great information in there that you'll find. It's also a great little book to send over to anyone that you know who might be interested in getting started on keto or just learning more about the science behind it and how to test for ketosis, and all of these different things are in the book. So I hope that you enjoy it. And if you sign up for my newsletter, just know I don't send out a ton of stuff, maybe once a month at the most. If there's something I've come across that's interesting, I don't send out a weekly newsletter. I don't really like getting emails all that often myself, but when I do find something interesting that I think that you will enjoy, sometimes I'll send out a new recipe that I've worked on for the blog, or just something, an article or study that I think you might find interesting. But for the most part, it's not a high volume newsletter. So you can know that if you receive something from me, it's something I think you'll really find valuable. So you can go to ketogenicgirl.com and click on free ebook, enter your name and email, and you'll get your free copy of my brand new ebook, Keto Reset. I recommend you check out my 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. What it is a full 28-day meal plan and program that includes all the recipes and foods that you need to eat for 28 days. I call it the 28-day challenge because it's just a great way to get past all the information overwhelm. There's so much information online about keto, and this way you can just get past that. All the macros are calculated for you to get into a state of ketosis, and I was able to do that by using tried and true proven macro approaches that I've developed over several years of doing the keto diet and working with over 3,000 people to date on this program. Our Ketogenic Girl community in the members group is incredible. Everyone in there is so supportive, providing helpful tips and hints and sharing their successes and struggles and challenges as well in the group together, because we're all in this together gaining more health. The 20-day challenge program comes with weekly shopping lists, meal plan overviews, a guide to testing yourself and interpreting the results for keto, and it also comes with my support and coaching in our members only group. So go check it out at ketogenicgirl.com. It's the 28-day challenge, and any purchase of the 20-day meal plans gets you access into the challenge. You can choose to get the program either soft copy or with a printed copy as well. It's printed on beautiful paper, spiral bound, and I ship it out to you the same day. So go check it out, the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge at ketogenicgirl.com. A few disclaimers. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice, as I am not a qualified healthcare provider. The information presented on this podcast is for educational purposes only. Ketogenic Girl is not qualified to provide medical advice. Consult your own physician for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to this podcast. Prior to beginning a ketogenic diet, you should undergo a full health screening with your physician to confirm that a keto diet is suitable for you and to rule out any conditions or contraindications that may pose risks or that are incompatible with a ketogenic diet. A keto diet may or may not be appropriate for you if you have any kind of health condition, whether known to you or unknown. So you must consult your physician to find this out. Anyone under the age of 18 should consult with their physician and their parents or legal guardian. Welcome, Amber. Thank you so much for being here with us again. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
We had a really fun discussion last time. We were talking a lot about you and your personal journey with low carb and keto and zero carb. And it was really fascinating. There's a few things in your research that we didn't get to touch on last time that I wanted to talk about, but I really want to get into your latest presentation. You were presenting at Low Carb Breckenridge, and you were talking about ketosis without starvation. Can you talk a little bit about what made you want to share some of the research in that?
Sure. Well, I've always been a little bit bothered by statements at the beginnings of papers about ketosis where, they're explaining what ketosis is, and they always start off by saying ketosis is this way we mimic fasting. And although it's absolutely true that when you fast, you are in ketosis, and therefore many of the things that we see in a body that are going on during fasting are the same as what we see during ketosis. And a lot of our research is informed by studies in fasting. It has this implication that ketosis is like fasting in that it is stressful and that it's not natural. And that's not really the case, especially for humans who have a special relationship with ketosis, in that we're able to maintain ketosis even if we have more than enough protein and more than enough calories. And so this presentation was focused on this idea that humans, unlike other species, have a great ability to be in ketosis and why that is.
Right. And I think some of the findings that you brought up that were the most interesting that kind of stayed with me. One of them was the fact that when someone is doing this kind of ketogenic lifestyle or approach, that you talked a little bit about the fed state and the fasted state, and how on a standard American or high carb diet that people would take a while to deplete their glycogen after eating, and on a ketogenic diet actually deplete the glycogen quite a lot faster after eating. And so you go back into a fasted state more rapidly in ketosis.
Right. So a lot of researchers, even those who aren't really talking about ketogenic diets, have acknowledged that we have these two kinds of modes. One is some researchers call the glucose mode versus the ketone mode. And what they're really talking about is this fed state and fasted state, and about how important it can be to have some periods in each, because the fed state obviously gives you all the materials to build things and it gives the hormonal signal to build things. But if you had some period without food, then you're not going to have the signals that tell you what you need. So, for example, fasting can tell your body make more mitochondria or make more neurons, and then when the food comes back in, that will be prioritized. But what they're looking at usually, and so for example, you might be talking about research in intermittent fasting, they're usually looking at either an animal that is not in ketosis when fed, or they're looking at humans who are not on a ketogenic diet. And so the amount of time it takes to get into that fasting state is quite a lot. I've been seeing this headline. I haven't really looked at the actual paper, but the headline says something like, after 3 days of fasting, your entire immune system is regenerated, or something like that. And what I think every time when I see that is, well, it takes about 2 days for a human on standard American diet or even just high carb diet from somewhere else to get into the fasting mode, whereas someone who's already on a ketogenic diet is practically there. A few hours after eating, they're going to be there. And so we on ketogenic diets have this advantage where we're able to get into that recuperating stage almost right away every single day, just overnight.
That really is amazing, and I guess it has to do with the fact that your glycogen stores are depleted just from being keto and not eating and consuming or drinking things all throughout the day. So you're kind of going more into that fasted state more often with more time restricted eating and intermittent fasting.
Yes, the glycogen stores, when you're trying to reach this fasted state from a high carb diet, the first thing that has to happen is you have to use up those glycogen stores. And before you do that, you will not get into ketosis. I don't mean use up the entire thing, but you have to get to a certain level, and we're much closer to that all the time on a ketogenic diet.
Hey guys, I want to tell you about a super fun giveaway contest that I'm doing from now until the end of September. You can enter by going to iTunes and leaving me a rating or review. You will enter to win a free copy of my Build Your Day meal plans. I'll ship them to you. They have over 200 delicious keto recipes, and you can custom build your own meal plan day by day by using the recipes and all the forms in there that I have. There are tons of resources in there and so many easy to make recipes. I also have a no-cook version of the plans, and you as the winner can choose which one you get, the regular Build Your Day or the no-cook Build Your Day. And these meal plans are an extension pack as a part of the 28-day challenge. They retail for $249, but if you are a member of the 28-day challenge, they're only $49, and I will ship you one for free if you are the winner of this contest. So to enter, you can go to iTunes and leave me a rating or review anytime between now and the end of September, and your rating or review will enter you into the contest with one entry. And you can go to Ketogenic Girl under contest giveaway and find all of the details and full contest rules there. It is open to anyone living in the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and parts of Europe as well. So go ahead and leave me a rating or review. Go to Ketogenic Girl under giveaway contest to find out more from the drop-down menu with all the full rules and requirement information there. So good luck to the winner, and thanks in advance for leaving me a rating or review. I can't wait to read it. Right. Now, I'm not sure if you mentioned in your presentation how long it takes when you're in nutritional ketosis to go back into a fasted state after, if there was any data on that.
I don't know of any studies that measure that exact timing, but on a high carb diet, for example, there's this other contrasting set of phases called the absorptive phase and the post-absorptive phase. So the absorptive phase is right after you've eaten, how long it takes to incorporate and clear away all the exogenous glucose. So all of that incoming glucose has to be dealt with. And that phase lasts about 4 hours. And it's only after that can you get into this so-called post-absorptive phase where you're using up your glycogen. So you've already got built in this 4-hour delay that we wouldn't have on a ketogenic diet. So at the very minimum, you could say that a ketogenic diet gives a 4-hour advantage.
That's so interesting because I talk a lot about how most people, in our modern world just never engage their metabolic flexibility because there's just so much food or beverage coming in all the time that there's no time for the body to ever really get into that fasted state. And you talking about, the post-absorptive state and how it's about 4 hours. And, most people eat probably more frequently than even 4 hours.
Yeah, and I think that has to do with the blood sugar roller coaster that a high carb diet induces. I see this a lot. I have children, and in the schools, it's very well understood that children are going to get cranky even faster than adults. They're going to get cranky and hungry from their lowering blood glucose. And so there's a tradition of feeding constant snacks throughout the day at school just to keep children from going a little bit hypoglycemic, I think. And I find that really fascinating because when my children go to school, when they're on a low carb diet, they could go pretty much all day without needing to eat again. And that's, children need to eat more frequently generally. So I find that pretty fascinating. And I think that these habits that children are developing of eating all the time then continue on into adulthood. And yeah, you're basically never off that roller coaster.
I like to sometimes say that, we're always grazing or nursing. And, there's just always something coming in. It seems from, I know I was like that definitely before I found keto and also intermittent fasting and time restricted eating from, my first coffee or latte in the morning until pretty much before going to bed, there was always something being imbibed or eaten in some way. And so it's amazing that the only time my body was actually getting into a fasted state was during sleep.
Right. And I've heard, I don't know how common this is. I've never experienced it myself, but I know that some people who have high level of metabolic dysfunction actually wake in the night and need to eat as well. So it's just around the clock.
Oh, that's incredible. That's just incredible. Now, what were some of the other key points in your presentation on a low carb rec that you wanted to really get across?
Well, one of the things is about species differences in our ability to get into ketosis, and particularly with respect to protein ingestion and also calories. So in most other animals, in all other animals that we've looked at as far as I know, if you feed them enough food and enough protein that they're not hungry anymore, they're not in ketosis. Rodents are the closest to us in their ability to get into ketosis. Some of the researchers I've talked to, for example, Ben Beekman, has worked with getting rodents into ketosis in order to be able to do experiments about the ketogenic state. And he said that it was very difficult to get them into ketosis without having a caloric deficit, which he really wanted to make that difference because you don't want the people evaluating it to chalk up the difference in what's going on physiologically to a caloric deficit. You want to be able to say this is due to ketosis. And
Right.
Similarly, Stephen Phinney has said that the line between adequate protein and too much for ketosis is vanishingly small in the rodents that he's worked with. Whereas humans, we can not only eat as much as we need to maintain weight and to satisfy our hunger, but we can eat more protein than the minimum and be in ketosis by a large margin. If you look at certain studies where people have been on ketogenic diets, related in particular what the exact amount of protein that you can take it up to before you stop being in ketosis, and it gets conflated by how much carbohydrate is in the diet, because if you take all the carbohydrate out, then you can eat more protein. But even without having isolated that specifically, you can look at the studies and see that somewhere between maybe 1.5 to 2 times the minimum needs for protein can be consumed, and you can still be in ketosis, which is drastically different from other animals. Dogs, for example, which are carnivores, they can eat a zero carb diet that's just made up of meat, and they won't be in ketosis unless they have either been in a caloric deficit, been in a protein deficit, or been given MCT oils. So there's a clinic that treats cancerous dogs called Keto Pet Sanctuary, and they use ketosis to help dogs with cancer. And I spoke to the staff there, and they confirmed that you can't just give a dog a raw meat diet, which you should be doing anyway, but you're going to have to do more to get a dog to be constantly in ketosis. Actually, that can tell us a lot, because why would we have developed this ability to continue to be in ketosis when we have more than enough protein to switch back to a glycolytic state? And I think that the reason has to do with our brains requiring so much energy, being so benefited by ketosis.
I was just going to ask you, why do you think that is, that the dogs don't really need, to be adapted for ketosis, whereas humans do? So it does make a lot of sense that the brain would benefit. Dr. Beekman and I were actually chatting this morning exactly about that, and how the brain does prefer ketones and how the brain starts to adapt by developing more mitochondria, which I didn't realize before. It just absolutely blew my mind. That the brain could be having more and more of these little energy factories. I've known it with muscle and fat to an extent, with brown fat, but had no idea about the brain. So that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that either, but I'm not at all surprised. The brain is a total energy hog. I mean, even the adult brain uses about 20% of all the energy that we're using at any given time, even at rest. But if you think about a developing brain, imagine a baby and the proportion of their body that is their head. I think that the proportion of energy in an infant is something more like 60%. I don't have the exact figure, but the fact that a baby brain is using so much energy, it may explain why human babies are actually so fat. Most mammals that are born aren't born with all this extra subcutaneous fat. And some researchers, including Stephen Cunnane and others, have argued that the best explanation for that is that it's to supply the brain with energy in the form of ketones. The brain loves ketones, as you said, and infants are in mild ketosis all the time when they're being breastfed, and they're 3 to 4 times more efficient using ketones than adults are. So they use it for energy. They also use it structurally. So your brain is made out of cholesterol and fat, long-chain fatty acids, and almost all of the cholesterol and the fatty acids that are used to make myelin and gray matter and white matter are made in situ in the brain. But long-chain fatty acids don't cross the blood-brain barrier very well, and so they're built out of ketone bodies. They can also be built out of glucose, but if you look at what they're actually being built out of, the majority of it is actually being come from ketone bodies. So there's an energy role, there's a structural role, and then there's also the neuroprotection that we have seen when we've studied things like traumatic brain injury. Ketosis will actually protect damage from spreading. So when you put all of those things together, you can see how advantageous it would be for a developing brain to be in a state of ketosis. And in fact, it is, at least before we're weaned, if you don't wean them onto a high-carb diet.
All of this just makes me think that for optimal brain function, we almost need to go into ketosis at some point.
I think so, certainly for optimal function. Many mammals actually have ketosis or use ketones during the nursing period, which is, in other animals, brain growth kind of stops at the end of breastfeeding. Whereas in humans, brain growth doesn't stop at the end of breastfeeding. We actually have very steep rates of brain growth after birth, which is also unusual. And then past weaning, it stays as steep as fetal development for a little bit, and then for a long time, it continues to grow quite a lot, even though it's at slower rates. And so if ketosis is the natural state for growing a brain during breastfeeding, then you would think that you would want to keep that up past weaning. In fact, you can't really even stop it if you're feeding the recommended by some cereal diets, because infants and young children go into ketosis much more rapidly. They're a lot more like we were talking about earlier about how if we're on a ketogenic diet, soon after we eat, we're back in that sort of fasted metabolism. But if you're on a high carb diet, it takes longer. But in children and in infants, it doesn't take as long to get back into ketosis. And so basically, they're going to get into it while they're sleeping, even if you're feeding them a high carb diet.
So in your talk, you mentioned increased mitochondrial biogenesis. So is that happening just from being in a ketogenic state and being in nutritional ketosis?
I believe so. Like I said earlier, a lot of the research that we have on ketogenic diets actually comes from fasted animals. And so I'm not 100% sure, now that you ask me that, if the mitochondrial biogenesis is induced by a ketogenic diet without fasting, but I would suspect that it is.
Yeah, Dr. Beekman mentioned this morning that just the presence of ketones, he was theorizing, I'm not sure if he had concluded the study or not yet, but that it did increase biogenesis in the brain, because it does in other tissues in the muscle and the fat. But you had a slide on increased uncoupling proteins. If you could maybe talk a little bit more about that and what happens to the brain on ketones.
Sure. I was talking about the metabolic effects from ketogenic diets that can be beneficial to the brain. And so I listed several of them that, besides the ketone bodies themselves, that have been found to be either downstream or at the same time affect as the higher ketones that have been used as possible explanations for why a ketogenic diet is so effective in epilepsy. And the fact that a ketogenic diet can prevent a brain that's been having seizures to keep going into seizures is by itself a remarkable effect. But some of the different effects that have been suggested as possible causes for why seizures are reduced include the reduction in glucose itself, the increased uncoupling proteins that we know when we're studying brown fat and thermogenesis is happening. There's increased mitochondrial biogenesis, and there's decreased radical oxygen species. We have increased glutathione, which is a very powerful antioxidant. And then there are changes in neurotransmitters in the proportion of things like norepinephrine, GABA, glutamine, adenosine, all of which have profound effects on how the brain works. And then something that I'm particularly interested in recently, which is the plasma availability of free fatty acids, particularly the polyunsaturated fatty acids, DHA and arachidonic acid. And the reason that I'm so interested in those in particular is because DHA and arachidonic acid are really important as phospholipids in the brain. And we talk about DHA a lot. I think that's because there's a lot of favorable attitude toward omega-3 fatty acids, but arachidonic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid, is also actually really important in brain phospholipids. And if you look at certain disease states like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, they are characterized by dysregulation of the phospholipids and the arachidonic acid and DHA. So one of the well-replicated effects of being on a ketogenic diet is that there's this increased availability of DHA, arachidonic acid, and that the phospholipids are maintaining those the way that they should be in order to have a healthy cell membrane. So I think that may be one of the reasons that a ketogenic diet is so powerful and that ketosis is so powerful, especially for a growing brain, because these need to be incorporated. If you look at the fat we were talking about earlier that infants have, the subcutaneous fat, it's different from the way an adult would be fat in that, first of all, it's all subcutaneous. It's not visceral fat, the way an unhealthy obese person would begin to have this visceral accumulation of fat. But an obese adult, or even a non-obese adult, their subcutaneous fat is in many ways a reflection of what they're eating. So if you're eating a lot of polyunsaturated fat, a lot of linoleic acid, for example, your subcutaneous fat is going to reflect that in proportion. But infant fat doesn't do that even if the mother is eating a lot of linoleic acid. It's actually quite low in polyunsaturated fatty acids, but those polyunsaturated fatty acids are really high in DHA and arachidonic acid. And I think that it speaks more to this reason that we have that fat in the first place, is to provide the brain with the ketone bodies and the particular kinds of fatty acid that it needs.
I've always found it fascinating that breast milk has medium chain triglycerides in it.
Yes, that may be part of the reason that breastfed infants are in deeper ketosis than those who are eating formula.
Right. And unfortunately, a lot of the formula, the main ingredient seems to be glucose or corn syrup in some cases, which would be a completely different profile, than breast milk.
Yeah, that's interesting. Breast milk, some people have objected to the fact that babies are in ketosis, even though it's an observable fact, by saying, well, that doesn't make sense because breast milk has all this carbohydrate in it. And it does. It is, I think it's about 40% carbohydrate, but that's lactose, which is about half glucose and half galactose. Mm-hmm. And the galactose actually is probably being used to build brain structures. And besides that, a small proportion of the carbohydrates are these oligosaccharides, which have an immune building function. Many of them actually pass through. So you're absolutely right. It's the carbohydrate, if your first pass at building an infant formula was to just replicate the macronutrients, you're not going to get the same kinds of carbohydrates or the same kinds of fatty acids that breast milk gives, and to the baby's detriment. There's been recognition that DHA is important, so that's been included, and that's one nice step, but it's one small step.
Right. Now, maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the work that you've done exploring the weaning. I think it was a weaning of babies onto meat, and tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, there have been some studies actually comparing eating meat, weaning directly onto meat versus weaning onto fortified cereals. The fact that cereals have to be fortified should already be a hint that they're not really a great first food. The reason they need to be fortified is specifically for iron, and I think they may also fortify for zinc. And those are micronutrients that are absolutely essential to brain growth. Brain growth happens in stages, and if you don't complete one of those stages properly, you may not be able to complete the subsequent stages. And if you don't get all of the micronutrients that your brain needs, you can have developmental delays, you can have disabilities, you can have emotional fragility, actually. And some of those things are recoverable if you get those nutrients later, but some of them aren't or aren't completely recoverable. So it's been long known that if you're going to give babies cereal, you have to fortify it. But there have been studies that compared fortified cereal to meat weaning. And they have found, for example, one study found that the babies who were weaned onto meat had a higher zinc status. They had plenty adequate iron, even though they didn't have that benefit of fortification. Another study showed that there was increased head growth, and head growth is a proxy for brain size. And this is important not just because it's not just that brain size is correlated with intelligence, but the amount that your brain grows after you're born is correlated with intelligence. So if you're growing more, if your brain is growing more after birth, that is correlated with higher intelligence. And that was found when you're comparing the meat babies to the cereal babies. And another study was specifically worried about, they acknowledged that there would be better growth after meat weaning versus cereal weaning, but they were a little bit worried that this growth would be actually just fatter babies in a way that might predispose them to obesity later. And what they found was that the extra growth was actually not extra adipose growth. It was just extra growth in general. So the La Leche League and the Canadian government, for example, now have on their list of recommendations meat as an ideal first food, even though they still would also support cereals.
Hey guys, just taking a really quick break to talk about the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. If you're interested in doing a ketogenic diet for yourself, it's a great place to start. I teach you everything about how to follow a keto diet to get yourself into nutritional ketosis, and it includes 28 days of meal plans. It comes with weekly shopping lists, how to interpret results, how to test yourself, a complete guide to getting started on keto. If you've been keto for a while and you're just not getting the results that you want to in terms of your health or fat loss, or you are brand new to keto, the 28-day challenge is a great option because it also comes with my free coaching and support in our members Facebook group. And you can post any questions that you have about the meal plans, about keto, and I am there supporting you. We have an amazing community in our group. I like to call it the happiest place on earth because everybody in there is so excited about following keto, about having found something that really works well for them. And everyone in there is just so kind, caring, generous, and supportive. And it's a really fun place to be and hang out. So if you'd like more info on it, you can find it at ketogenicgirl.com. And it's the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. And now back to our interview. Wow, that's fantastic. That actually makes me be proud to be Canadian.
Yes, me too.
That's really, really exciting and surprising as well, and really cool to see. And as long as, it's there as an option, it doesn't have to be reversed out of everything necessarily right now. Although, just knowing the bioavailability of nutrients and how high it is. And I've been studying so much of this over the summer because I've been doing zero carb and carnivore, but, seeing how many nutrients you can get. But exactly as you said, if a food needs to be fortified, what's the reasoning behind it? Well, it's definitely more economical than, buying meat, but at the same time, at the expense of what, and that's, brain's development is really important. So that's really cool that you've been doing some work and research on that.
Yeah, and it's kind of parallel to the infant formula, where if you give them cereal as their weaning food and you're adding back these things that we've identified as being important, that doesn't mean that we've got the whole picture right, and it doesn't mean that it is going to be as healthy for you as the thing it's trying to mimic. And certainly a cereal doesn't mimic meat particularly well.
Yeah, I can't even put those two in the same. Yeah. I mean, it's almost you're talking about one that's probably detrimental and the other is, extremely beneficial. It's hard to compare. I mean, not even apples and oranges there. So different nutritionally. But I guess around what age do people start weaning babies?
Typically around 4 to 6 months.
Oh, I could see egg yolks and liver and all that being so good and easy to, to eat for even if you don't have teeth.
Yes, right. And so nutrient dense too.
So nutrient dense. I mean, eggs are just my favorite food in the world because of the biological value, the protein in it. And I think it's second to breast milk. So, I mean, it's right up there.
Yeah, well, it was made for a developing
Right.
organism. So it's got choline, it's got vitamin A, and it's got a lot of things comparable to liver, in fact.
Now, going back to your earlier point from your presentation about protein levels, I'd love to switch gears a bit and talk about that. I mentioned I was, chatting with Ben Beekman this morning, and, we got to talk a lot about that because his research has really influenced me in terms of the research I think he did with dogs, or maybe studies that he had presented where they talked about, excess protein or high amounts of protein spiking insulin on a standard American diet, but not when the insulin to glucagon ratio is lower on a low carb diet. And if it's around a 1-to-1, that it doesn't, in fact, spike insulin in the same way. And I just found that fascinating. And then obviously trying out, zero carb for myself over the last few months. And I test a lot on myself, and we're all different. So it's all about, our bioindividuality as well. But I used to think always that eating too much protein was kicking me out of ketosis. And what I've realized that it was actually, I think, the other stuff that I was eating with it, because if you're eating more protein, you're probably also eating more carb. You're probably also eating more fat. And I think it may have been just the higher levels of carb that were doing it. But then going to zero carb, I've been amazed to see how well I can stay in ketosis. My blood sugar in the morning is higher if I have, my meal around dinner time, but I've been in ketosis the entire time, and I've been playing around with much higher levels of protein, and it's been really, really interesting. Not that a human has to be in a ketogenic state all the time, but for myself, to see that you could have higher levels of protein, especially with lower levels of carb, and stay really well in ketosis was very interesting.
Yeah, I think that work that Ben Beekman is talking about, how the response to protein and to other macronutrients for that matter is different on a ketogenic diet, is really important and often overlooked. I have a small blog post about it myself. I didn't have access to or didn't find all of the studies that he found, but I did find one experiment from 1971. What I was trying to figure out at that time was the blood glucose response to protein, because we know that actually if you're on a high carb diet, there isn't a blood sugar response to protein. It basically stays the same. But if you're a keto dieter, so they had tested keto dieters, they had been, I think, on a ketogenic diet for a small amount of time, but enough probably to get keto adapted. And when they ate protein, their blood sugar did go up, but the interest, like Dr. Beekman said, the insulin and glucagon ratio didn't actually change.
Mm-hmm.
So in response to protein, if you're on a keto diet, the insulin to glucagon ratio stays constant and the blood sugar goes up a little. Whereas if you're on a glycolytic diet, your insulin to glucagon ratio actually goes up, but your blood sugar stays more constant. And so I think the idea that protein is going to kick you out of ketosis comes from two ideas, some parts of which are true and parts of which are not. One is that just because protein can be turned into sugar, that it will be. And I've looked at other experiments where just giving the substrate clearly doesn't induce gluconeogenesis. But I think if you're in that state where you're ketogenic and you eat some protein, your insulin to glucagon ratio stays constant. And that really is the glucose production regulator, much more than absolute levels of either of the hormones. But your blood sugar is going to rise a little bit. And so the more you eat, the more you're going to get into this other state where the insulin to glucagon ratio is going to change. And so I think that the amount of protein will gradually shift you over from the state where insulin to glucagon ratio won't be affected affected to the state where it will be. And so for me, that's the explanation why we can tolerate quite a bit more protein than we might expect and still stay into ketosis, but that eventually it does start to tip over. And in diabetics in particular, I think that happens much more quickly. And so for people who are on a ketogenic diet because they're a recovering diabetic, they might be a lot more sensitive to protein than those who are not.
That's a really good point. I didn't think about that, would be that there would be more sensitivity to that for a diabetic.
I think that it has to do with the glucagon being
Right.
already overexpressed in a way that makes their responses different.
That makes total sense. Yeah, it's really interesting. Now, I know we talked a little bit more about you and your lifestyle. I know you basically just eat intuitively to stay shady. You follow zero carb diet and you've been doing carnivore for quite a long time. And do you ever, I'm curious, test yourself for, I'm sure you do test yourself for ketosis. And do you find that there's kind of a protein range that you have, or what have you found in doing any testing on yourself?
I have to admit, I haven't been very systematic about it, but I have measured ketones in the morning many times, and I tend to be somewhere in the, a little between 0.5 and 1 to above, sometimes even above 1, closer to the 2 range for millimoles. And there's some variance in that. One thing I have noticed is that if I have a really big eating day, the next day it does tend to be lower. So I think that I am seeing an effect of the amount of food, the amount of meat that I'm eating.
Well, I mean, it makes sense that your body wouldn't need to convert as much into ketones because you have other fuel coming in energy forms and, probably fat and primarily, and then maybe some of the protein as well.
And of course, it's going to depend on exercise levels too. So if I had gone out and done a lot of, say, cycling or had been lifting weights, that will also push you more into the ketosis side more quickly.
Right. Now, do you do any sort of time restricted eating in terms of what time you stop eating during the day? Because I find that makes a huge difference when I test my blood glucose. If I eat past even 6 or 7, that my blood glucose is much higher than if I had my last meal sort of around, 4 p.m., 5 p.m.
Yes, that's an excellent point. There was a long time where I ate most of my meals from lunch onward and would have my last meal quite late. And actually, it's really a practicality because I have to collect my children from school and get them home and then cook so that we can all have a meal together. And so it's a rare occasion when I can actually eat early unless I've really planned ahead well and I don't want a meal that requires an hour of cooking or more after we get home. But on those occasions where I have eaten my last meal at around 4 o'clock, I think I actually feel better and definitely my ketone levels are higher.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I've just been loving getting to, speak with people like yourself who've been, doing all of this research, because you're not just doing a zero carb lifestyle, because someone told you to. I mean, you're doing all the research, very in-depth research, and presenting on it and, presenting your findings as well. And it's great to see how much you've sort of based your lifestyle around all of these studies and research.
Thank you. Yes. Well, I've been really curious about it for a very long time. And I was curious about ketogenic diets long before I discovered zero carb diets. But I didn't really start writing about them on a blog until after the carnivorous diet had such a profound effect on my life. And it was partly because it felt so important at that point because of the effect that it had on me that I wanted to share that information. But then also, honestly, I think the mental health benefits that the zero carb diet gave me allowed me to take on bigger projects and to express myself more than I had been able to do when I was living in a sort of from one depressive episode to the next.
Now, I know last time you were on, we touched on, I love how you always say, I came for the weight loss and I stayed for the mood. And my biggest thing is I really wanted to understand what that qualitative difference was. And I have to say that I have experienced it, the zero carb Zen, and I didn't understand it before, why it could make a difference and such a profound difference. But having this calm, peaceful, happy state that I had never really experienced before, maybe since I was a little child, has been really, really interesting. And I wanted to ask you, because last time we spoke, a lot of people I see over and over talking about experiencing the zero carb zen, experiencing this calmness, peacefulness, happiness, just shrugging things off their shoulder, not really, getting so upset about small things as much. And we talked about your theory about it being related to the gut lining and going back to the gut. And I know there's a big connection between anxiety and the gut, but I wonder what some of the other factors are, because I do find it curious. Dr. Sean Baker talks about the connection with food security and how once you have all your essential amino acids and fatty acid needs met, that you get this calmness because your body's sated, like it's satiated. And so you have this, maybe that contributes to some of the Zen factor. And then other people have spoken about, getting your neurotransmitters and, there's all these different aspects to it. So I'm curious if you've come across any more.
Well, I do think that the micronutrient aspect, including protein, is also a nutrient, but the ones that we've already talked about for brain growth could be a big part of it. So that's inclusion of meat, whether or not you're excluding plants, can help with that to make sure that you're getting all the nutrients that your brain requires. And I like the way that he has articulated that. The plant exclusion can help from a micronutrient perspective too. If you look at Dr. Georgia Eads' work, she's explained a lot about the anti-nutrient properties of plants and the fact that you can't just take some kind of calculator where you throw in all these different foods and then add it up, because it doesn't reflect the fact that many kinds of plants actually have a subtractive value when you put them on. So that the zinc, for example, when you eat zinc, if you're eating grains with those, even probably other plants that have certain anti-nutrients in them, the level of zinc that is actually going to make it into your system is much, much less. So I think the micronutrients are important. Another thing that can affect micronutrients and the distribution of them is the ketogenic state itself. So remember when we were talking about how one of the effects of a ketogenic diet is to make the DHA and the AHA much more available in the bloodstream, and how that can have an effect on, for example, diseases where there's flux dysregulation. Schizophrenia shows this great flux of the phospholipids. The arachidonic acid is coming out of the phospholipids, constantly being broken down. And if you don't have your bloodstream flush with them, it's not going to be able to recoup it. So the ketogenic state itself is making access to certain micronutrients a lot more abundant. And I think that's the case. Well, we know that there are effects on, for example, folate. People who are on a ketogenic diet have increased folate levels even without taking in more folate. So this combination of being ketogenic, of getting adequate meat, and of not disrupting the micronutrient profile by adding plants that are actually taking away the absorptibility or the access to certain micronutrients, I think is a very powerful combination, even aside from the way it might be affecting gut permeability.
Right. And that's such a great point for, anyone listening who is, still very much interested in just following a ketogenic diet and feeling maybe a little bit overwhelmed by, this carnivore trend and zero carb and, why do I have to cut out, or exclude vegetables? Maybe do you know what there's so much discussion now about anti-nutrients and the anti-nutrients binding to some of these micronutrients, and preventing absorption and causing disruption, or people who are more carb sensitive. But are there some plant foods that you would say are maybe the least disruptive, or that would be, I'm not sure if you've tracked much of it because you don't really consume many vegetables, but are there some that are kind of a better bet for people?
Yes, certainly. Part because of the perspective of the plant, the anti-nutrients are going to be most concentrated in protection of, for example, reproductive parts, and less protected, for example, in certain kinds of fruits where there might even be an incentive for the plant to try to have an animal swallow the fruit as long as they're not digesting the seed. So some of the plants that might be less troublesome would include, I think, Probably cucumbers and squashes. I don't know. It's funny. I don't want to go out too much on a theoretical limb because I can remember several years ago, my ex-husband had asked me, "What do you think might be the most benign vegetable?" And I thought about it, and I just made a purely speculative guess, and I said, "I don't know, maybe celery," because I was thinking it's just like a stalk that it's mostly water. And it turns out celery is one of the most allergenic foods there is. It's on, if you go to Europe, you're in Europe. If you go to Europe, it's often, it's marked on the menu which things contain celery in some places. So
right. I mean, I didn't know the allergenic properties. I just thought, because of the nitrates are higher, I think, in celery than in processed meats.
They are, in fact. So if some of these companies that make bacon want to make it sound like their product is better for you, because they say it doesn't include nitrates, and then there's an asterisk, and it says, if you follow it, it says, except for the naturally occurring nitrates in celery, and they use celery powder. I don't know if we've talked about one of my sons who has had severe response materials by having ADHD-like symptoms, actually was more affected by the celery bacon than regular nitrate bacons. So yeah, I don't want to speculate too much about that because, well, even many of the nightshade vegetables, a tomato, for example, is a fruit, and I wouldn't lump that in with a safe one. I know that paleomedicina, if you ask them, they will give you a list of the vegetables that they consider safest from the intestinal permeability point of view, but I don't have the exact list.
That's very, very interesting. I find one of the benefits that I realize has just been having a very calm mood. And I thought that my blood sugar was stable before trying zero carb. And it's been really interesting, especially because there were certain sort of higher carb foods like dark chocolate and, coconut butter. I did 100% dark chocolate. So I thought I was, safe, but you eat enough of that and the carbs, really do add up. And for me, I feel like that zen has really been from having stable blood sugar. I mean, there's a lot to be said for that. We talk about the excitability and the up and down roller coaster that sugar and carb, do to us. But then when you have incredibly stable blood sugar from following a ketogenic lifestyle or doing any kind of low carb, keto, whole foods approach, having balanced blood sugar and stable blood sugar that's consistent, it's a really nice benefit.
I think that the fibers are also not completely neutral. There have been blood sugar responses to different fibers. There are many different kinds of fibers, and there may also be a response by stimulating the flourishing of certain bacteria with respect to others that could be having an effect if you're feeding fiber. I know that Eric Westman in particular has said multiple times in his talks that total carbohydrate is a much safer, more reliable indicator of what your results are going to be than net carbohydrates.
Yeah, from the beginning, I always advocated counting total carbs. For me, having fiber in a food didn't magically, make the carbs disappear just by having more fiber in them. So I would definitely agree with that. But I love all this talk that's coming out about fiber now and that people are discussing it. I found this doctor, I think he may have been a low carb. I'm not sure if it was Vail. Maybe you even met him there, but he's a doctor from Australia. So it may have been low carb down under. And he showed some research. I'm going to have him on the podcast soon, but showing the sort of IBD incidences of digestive issues and, categorized into all these different areas, constipation, bloating, pain, loose stool, all these different factors with a high fiber diet. And then that all of those went away on a low fiber diet. And then I think about all the people who, have dealt with digestive issues. I know I had many in my life and they're just being told all the time to eat more fiber. So I love that at least there's this dialogue, exploratory discussions and things happening about it, as opposed to it being this thing that you just can't question. It's the same with vegetables. If we never question them, we would never know about nightshades.
Right. Yeah, I think that might have been Paul Mason, Dr. Paul Mason. Does that ring a bell?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, I saw that video from the Low Carb Down Under and was very much appreciating it because, like you say, if you have a digestive disorder, often what your doctor will tell you or what a website will tell you is to eat more fiber. And that it simply doesn't reflect the research. If you eat none, it's actually more likely to help you than if you eat more. And that's even true for constipation disorders.
It's so counter to, everything that's, we've been told. And yeah, it's just really, really ingrained in us that fiber is so important for proper digestion. And I think for me, it was just this, zero carb and carnivore that made me start to look at it and question it, because I just don't think I would have explored the research on it. I would have just taken it as granted, because then I started to think, well, insoluble fiber means that, you can't break it down. And then you're just shoving all this stuff that your body can't break down through you. It just start to picture that. It just doesn't sound like a good thing.
Right. Well, I think one quote from his talk was something like, when you're trying to move something with large volume through a very small hole, adding more bulk doesn't really help.
Oh, that's hilarious. That's hilarious. Yeah, it's going to be fun to have him on the podcast too and talk about that. But I really appreciate you being here and sharing all of your information and research. And I just appreciate how much time you put into researching all of this and compiling studies. And I'm curious what's the next thing that we can look out for from you, and what kind of research you're the most excited about right now.
Well, I have given a couple of talks since BREC, which haven't been released yet. One of them was at the Ancestral Health Symposium in July, and that was about the Inuit and the genetic mutation that affects their ability to be in ketosis. And so I talked all about that controversy and different aspects of the gene that maybe people haven't been paying attention to that have an effect on that. And then I spoke at Keto Fest, actually the same weekend. It was a pretty intense weekend. And I was talking more about the carnivorous diet and differences that people are seeing between low carb and carnivorous diets and why that might be. And I did touch on the intestinal permeability idea more there. And then I'm going to be speaking at Low Carb Houston in October, and it will be actually more of a return to the things that we talked about today, about the development of the human brain and the importance of carnivorous diets and the inclusion of meat in our evolutionary development of the brain, as well as the individual development of the brain, and why ketosis is so important.
That all sounds so fascinating. Now, I just have to ask you one last thing. And you've been doing the zero carb carnivore lifestyle for a while. So I'm curious what you make of, the fact that it's become kind of trendy.
It's a little bit mind-blowing, actually, to have so much talk about something that was so obscure for so long. To meet people who are on carnivorous diets is something that never really happened to me before. And it's great that there are now so many other people who are contributing their experiences and research ideas in this space, and that there's so much more validation of something that I've been seeing in myself and in small obscure groups for a really long time. And what I'm hoping is that this movement will facilitate and incentivize studies so that we can find out what's really going on and how much of this is actually repeatable in trials and what the mechanisms might be, because it's been something that's been a mystery to me personally for so long.
Right. And I mean, a lot of it has to be coming from just the whole foods movement, because, everything from paleo to keto, low carb, zero carb, carnivore, what they all have in common is really, the fact that you're eating real food, and with zero carb, definitely emphasizing more protein intake, but why do you think all of this research and studies, and why is this all kind of coming more to light now?
Well, I really attribute it greatly to the work that Sean Baker, first of all, has done in getting the word out and collecting people's experiences and being very vocal about this. And then also, of course, to Jordan and Michaela Peterson, who have shared their stories and spoken with people who are highly influential, and Jordan Peterson himself is highly influential. And I think that has had a great effect on getting the word out to a large, much wider audience.
That's so true. Yeah, I saw Michaela tweeted today she's going to be on Joe Rogan, I think maybe this week or something. So
Fantastic.
yeah, it's cool because it definitely just brings it into a space where, I think it's funny that you present this plate with like a steak and a salad next to it and people go, wow, that's just the most nutritious meal. And then you take the salad away and people are like, well, now you're just, a psycho. So the fact that it can just be brought into conversation and seen more in the lens of, well, low carb is great, keto is great, zero carb, these are not, outlandish things. We have been carnivorous for, throughout history. We've always eaten meat, throughout our history. So, why should it be so outlandish just to, talk about these things?
Yes, I agree. And I'm really happy that so many more people are hearing about it because it has such potential to improve lives in a drastic way. And I think, the greatest risk in trying a carnivorous diet is that you get a little bit of social flack. And,
Right.
For that, the risk potential reward trade-off, the potential reward is astronomical compared to the risk. Even if it did nothing, even if you did it for a month and were like, oh, well, that didn't help me. The amount that you've lost compared to the amount that you could potentially gain is very little.
Right. And I like to say too, I think that what I've learned this summer, I think one of the best things that's just coming out of the fact that carnivore or zero carb is trendy is that people are questioning, limiting protein intake and eating more protein, like you said, because it is so, nutritious. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to forego eating carbohydrates completely or, like you've said before, you can definitely keep them as a part of your lifestyle and still get so many of the benefits just of eating more protein, with your vegetables.
That's an excellent point. I mean, even just knowing that many people are leading healthy lives eating only meat can help make a low carb diet that's got plants in it more acceptable, even a higher carb diet that just has more meat and more protein in it, more acceptable by comparison. And I think that's an important movement forward in and of itself.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Amber. It was great to have you on again, and we'll look forward to continuing to follow your research and have you on again in the future.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.